So 1968 is seen as the year when lots of the demands across the world for some kind of political or social change culminate in a variety of protests and oftentimes violent actions as well. So 1968 has a particular resonance as a year of revolution in the Western world. In the United States, it was a moment when there was a growing Vietnam, a protest about Vietnam. It's also most memory marked with the kind of chaotic scenes associated with the Democratic National Convention held in Chicago in 1968. So it certainly was a year in which street protests and the potential for revolution seemed quite high in the United States. Again, I've messed up my Jeopardy question again. So in 1968, this seasonal event saw an Eastern European government attempt to reform communism. The USSR didn't like it. What is the Prague Spring? That was an effort originally by the Czechoslovakian government not to overthrow communism, but to try and reform communism and introduce some element of free market reform and some political reform as well, in which the Soviet government stepped in and suppressed it. It was also the year that the Northern Irish Civil Rights Campaign began, which eventually, or the following year, kick-started a bloody civil war in Northern Ireland itself. So while some of these events were going on, for a time, France seemed to be a kind of oasis of stability, and there didn't seem to be any major changes or threats to the establishment of the Fifth Republic. Indeed, the Fifth Republic itself is a relatively new institution, and perhaps it's possible that the leadership felt that there wasn't really the same need for reform in France. However, 1968 eventually becomes a year in which there's actually a great deal of chaos in France that threatened the very existence of the state itself, or at least the government of the state. And the events began with college students. So the story of May 1968 in particular, when France seemed really on the edge of a major revolution, starts in the Université Paris-Nanterre. It's a branch of the University of Paris in Paris, where students have been demanding greater reforms, especially in relation to segregation of men and women. That male dorms and female dorms were obviously kept separate, and oftentimes men were not allowed to enter female dorms at all. And this was something that was true of the United States as well. I mean, in the 1950s, this was what were called the famous panty raids, where male students ran into female dorms, and oftentimes with the participation of female students kind of stole their underwear and waved them around. And that wasn't exactly what was going on in France in the late 1960s, but in particular there was a demand that one of the core demands amongst the students was that men be allowed to enter female dorms. And the leader of the student protests at the University of Paris-Nanterre was a guy called Daniel Cohn-Bendit, more popularly known as Danny the Red, in part because of his red hair, although obviously you can't see it here in the picture, but also because of his left-leaning politics. He was born in Germany originally, but was of Jewish descent, but was attending the University of Paris. And as a result of his efforts or his constant protest to gain access to the female dorms, he was expelled from the University of Paris-Nanterre. And this led to student protests demanding that he be reinstated in late 1967. And these protests were successful, and Danny Cohn-Bendit was allowed to re-enroll at Nanterre. But this kind of made students aware of the potential for student protest, the fact they had some degree of leverage over the university administrators. And in March 1968, a student protest began by occupying a building at Nanterre's campus. Essentially what the students were demanding for was greater transparency on how the university spent its money, and also for the university to try and do more to overcome social and class divisions in France, in particular providing an avenue for working class French students to access higher education. The university called the police. The protesters agreed to leave the building so long as their demands were published, and I think in the student newspaper, and the university agreed. But this led to, once the students came out of the building, the university decided it needed to take punitive action against students who were involved. And this led to an escalating series of suspensions and protests at university actions over the course of April 1968, culminating in once again the suspension of Danny the Red from the University of Paris, which led to more protests in early May 1968, and the university decided to close its doors. Then in light of this constant kind of stream of student protests, they decided to close down the university temporarily to allow tensions to ease off. But what this led to was the protest spreading to another branch of the university campus, University of Paris, at the Sorbonne, where students starting on May 3rd, 1968, went on strike in protest, demanding that the students who had been suspended from Nanterre be reinstated, and that the university open again. The French police directly confronted these protesters, and over the next couple of days, violent protests between student protesters and the French police broke out. And eventually on May 6th, the National Student Union and the National Union for Faculty Members at University called for a national strike to be held in Paris, which again led to increasing violence between the students and the police. Here's some images shown of what was going on. So the image on the right is obviously a characterization of the French riot police being projected essentially as the SS. The left says we are all undesirables. That was a comment so because Danny Cohen-Bendit was German and Jewish, some opponents of the strike suggested that this was simply foreign agitation or foreign undesirables who were responsible for this conflict. And in one famous scene, French students began chanting, "We are all German Jews now," identifying solidarity with Danny the Red. The following day, another another wave of protests took place in Paris, but this time high school students came out as well and participated in the strike. And their demands were that, the demands of all the people protesting, were that the two universities, so Nanterre and Sorbonne had also been closed by this stage, be reopened, that police withdraw from the university campuses, and that all students who'd been accused or being charged with criminal behaviour have those charges to be dropped as well. And they won the sympathy of some trade union activists in France as well, who called for a national strike to be held on May 13th. So this was a national strike in which a large number of students protested. Well, actually, I'll take a step back. So the strikes in early May 1968 in France ended up being quite violent. A lot of ordinary French people, or Parisians in particular, helped the student protests, even though they weren't students themselves, but felt that the police were overly heavy-handed. There were reports that police officers were throwing petrol bombs themselves and not really behaving as a kind of force that was solely focused on trying to maintain law and order. What was the attitude of traditional French left-wing organisations? You would assume that they would have been quite enthusiastic about the students and their protests, but actually there was a great deal of scepticism, and this was best displayed by a comment by Georges Marchais, who he was a prominent member of the Communist Party. He becomes leader of the Communist Party in the 1970s. He says that these students protesters were sons of the upper bourgeoisie who will quickly forget their revolutionary flame in order to manage daddy's firm and exploit workers there. So basically saying these are middle class students with too much time on their hand, and what would they really understand about the working class struggle of ordinary French people? Nevertheless, some trade unions were sympathetic with the demands of the students, and they called for a national strike to be held on May 13th. And this led to an enormous strike in Paris on May 13th, where over 1 million people showed up to demand, partly to demand, in order to get the students their demands, but also to kind of as a sense that there was more need to be done to kind of facilitate greater change in French society, that the French state had become kind of stagnant and was not kind of meeting the aspirations of the ordinary people of France. In response, so Charles de Gaulle was actually in Romania on a trip while all these strikes were taking place. He left everything into the hands of Georges Pompidou, and Pompidou decided on May 13th to basically give in to student demands, to reopen the Narbonne and the Nanterre and the Sorbonne, to have charges against students dropped in particular, and to start withdrawing the police from these campuses in the hope that this would put the kind of unrest to an end. But actually it didn't. What happened was, I have a Jeopardy question I want to bring up here. Bear with me just 1 second. What happened instead was, and apologies again, I guess I should proofread my slides before I record them. So this is the feline name given to a strike undertaken without union organisation. What is a wildcat strike? So what happened actually was, after the Pompidou kind of gave in to student demands, what we got was a series of strikes across Paris. So these are not students, although students did participate in strikes as well, but ordinary workers simply going out on strike, or in many cases occupying their own factories. Many of them were not part of organised labour. This was not part of a coordinated campaign by trade unions, but I think it was more a case of ordinary French workers kind of seeing the frustration of French students at the state of things and the lack of change and innovation in French society, and expressing their own kind of demand for change as well. Certainly, the intensity of the university protests increased dramatically. At Sorbonne, the students essentially took over the entire running of the university, declared it to be controlled by the hands of the Sorbonne Soviet, and began abandoning traditional curriculum and essentially teaching and offering lectures and talks on a wide variety of subjects about reform and change in society. And these strikes spread to other universities, where students started doing some very similar things, occupying university buildings, refusing to go to classes, and creating large working shops or talk shops about how French society could be improved. So France is starting to grind to a halt. About 1/3 of the French workforce was participating in these wildcat strikes. Revolutionary slogans were appearing everywhere. So this one says, "It is forbidden to forbid," as a sense of that there needs to be a more profound change in French society, and in some ways kind of encapsulating the radical revolutionary spirit of the 1960s. The more traditional trade unions of France began to try and take advantage of these strikes. So La Confédération Générale du Travail and their kind of a more moderate equivalent, the Force Ouvrière, FO, sought to leverage these talks into getting concessions from the government. And they did. They managed to, by the middle of May, negotiate with the Pompidou government what are called the Grenelle Protocol, or the Grenelle decrees, where it was decided that the minimum wage in France would be raised by 35%. All other French workers would immediately get a 10% raise. That workers who had lost money because they were out on strike would be fully compensated, paid that money back, and that the working week would also be shortened. But in some ways, this represents a disconnect between the leadership of trade unions and many of these people who were out on strikes, that for them it wasn't simply enough just to have a little more money or a little less working time, that they wanted a more kind of profound, albeit kind of vague, dramatic change in French society. All in particular, many of them demanded that de Gaulle be forced to resign. So these accords really don't succeed in reducing the number of strikes. In fact, the strikes seem to be spreading. And by the end of May, François Mitterrand announces that he's essentially willing to step in and take charge of France. That obviously, in his own word, the French state has effectively dissolved. The French economy has ceased to function because so many people are on strike, and there's a dire need for new political leadership. Pierre Mendès France makes a very similar statement. There is some talk that the two men might actually work together. And essentially what they're doing is kind of trying to emulate what de Gaulle did in May 1958. That as crisis spreads across the state, they were offering themselves as new potential leaders to try and reform France, to give leadership to the kind of dissatisfaction that's emerging, and to take control of affairs. There was division between them. Mitterrand was saying that he would create a new government, but it would not include the Communist Party. Pierre Mendès France was advocating to include the Communist Party, but in some ways Mitterrand and Mendès France were still seen as part of the political establishment, as were the French Communist Party, as were the various trade unions, and many of these workers felt that none of those guys are really talking about what we're talking about, that we're looking for a much more dramatic reform in French society. So what we have, by the end of May 1968, a series of strikes that began as student protests have led to not just almost universal student strikes across France, but general working strikes that have brought the French economy to a halt, and that seems to have created paralysis within the French government, that seems to have no idea really how to resolve this issue and how to put France moving forward once more.